Work is changing. The question is, are you? Welcome to 99 Problems But Work Ain't One, the new podcast series from How Now that will help you prepare for the fast-changing world of work. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be talking to disruptive startups, contrarian thinkers, global leaders, and real game changers, and asking them the burning questions about the challenges we face at work. From scaling cultures and adopting technology to improving well-being and building fast-learning organizations that are prepared for the future of work, we get the insights, tactics, and actionable nuggets of knowledge to put to work. Just because we sit in the same room, that doesn't make us a team. In fact, a lot of companies have lost sight of what a great team is because they're just doing things the way they've always been done. Those were just a couple of the hard truths Pam Hamilton shared with us in this week's episode. Pam recently released her second book, Supercharged Teams, which offers 30 tools for great teamwork, and she was kind enough to share some of them with us in this conversation. From why we all have a responsibility to call out opportunities for better behaviour, to how sending voice notes can be far more effective than writing long emails, and the need for shared goals in creating effective teams. This episode is packed with ideas for supercharging teams and resetting the rules around how we collaborate. Here's my conversation with Pam Hamilton. Pam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nelson. I'm delighted to be here.
Super excited. And firstly, congratulations on your book. Great reviews so far. And we're going to kind of cover a lot of what you've covered in your first book. If we get a chance, we might also dabble into your previous book, which is almost the Bible for running workshops. But we're going to start off with your most recent book, which you've got in the background there as well, Supercharged Teams. I thought a good place to start is probably with the why, right? Is why should someone supercharge their teams? And maybe in kind of conjunction to that, to understand what prompted you to write this in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. Good question. I actually started writing Supercharged Teams way before COVID because my passion is all in collaboration. So how do people work really well together? I've spent sort of a couple of decades in the corporate world, and my passion is collective intelligence. How do people make the most of their shared talents rather than just the individual talents? So I started writing it because I believe that in the last 5 years or so, work has changed hugely. So, we're much more under pressure. Work is a lot faster. We've got tons more data and information. We've got far fewer resources, whether you're in a public sector or a private sector job. Things have changed so much. And it just felt to me like people were working in the same way they always had done, just faster, right? And no one was sort of changing it. And really, there's a lot that we do need to basically just reset.
Yeah.
Because we're living in a different world now.
And it's interesting you say that was even before the pandemic. So everything you just said, just 10x in the kind of last 15 months. So kind of going back to the shifts that you mentioned, I guess placing it where we are now, 15 months into living in a pandemic, how have you seen the application of the tools that you talk about in your book? What has further changed, or are there parts of what you were thinking about that have just been expedited? Just place it for me in terms of the current context.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what we were already seeing was people working perhaps a little bit more remotely, people working in more global teams. The way that information and markets are being disrupted now means that it's very hard for us to contain all the expertise that we need in a small amount of people. We are forced to work with lots more people because we can't be experts in everything anymore. So we were already seeing people shifting towards remote working in global teams. But what's happened is obviously the remote working thing has been the biggest shift, that everybody has been forced to work, remotely or from home over the last 15 months. And while I understand that's been incredibly difficult for some people, and it's been incredibly difficult for some industries, especially those that aren't remote, I don't think it's all been positive. However, what has been positive is that people have seen that we can work just as hard, just as effectively, and in some ways even more inclusively remotely than we could in the way that we used to work. And I think that's kind of my excitement right now, even though it has been very difficult, and I don't want to sort of gloss over that. I think this next 6 months or this year is the real opportunity that we have, a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to rework the way we work, to use this pre-COVID and COVID chance to make a new, better normal and really reset the rules of how we collaborate.
And kind of before we go into some of the, we're not going to go through all 30 tools today. For that, people need to pick up a copy of the book. But we're going to touch on some of those tools that you talk about in the book. But let's talk about what the promised land is. What does a supercharged team look like? What is that ideal that you're working towards? And how would you know you've got a supercharged team? What are the kind of benefits and results you would see?
So, normal teams, average teams are fine. Nothing wrong with them. I think a supercharged team is a team who have elevated the way that they work to a high level of performance. So rather like a sports team, they've practiced well together, they've invested in how they work together. And when it comes down to it, when the competition is on or when the big game is on, they can really work in a brilliant way. And not only can they work really well and achieve amazing performance, they enjoy doing it too.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot that's within that. I mean, there's a lot of different elements within enjoying working together at high performance. A huge element is trusting each other and knowing each other well, and knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses, and knowing who to sort of pass the ball to continue the analogy. But not just knowing what people are good at, but really knowing that we've got each other's backs, that we really can support each other when things are difficult. And I think a massive part of that is our behaviors towards each other. So I think in the past, we've accepted perhaps not anyone's fault as such, but we've kind of accepted poor behaviors, or, sometimes we treat teams like families where we're like, oh, he's always like that, or she's always been like that, and kind of accepted it. And I think nowadays it's not really possible to do that anymore, because the world that we're working in is so competitive and so complex. We need to perform at a higher level. And so it's about calling out some of the things that perhaps aren't useful in a really positive and encouraging way, and working out what's the better way to work together. And that's quite hard, actually.
Yeah. And who's accountable for that? So who would own that part of it, right? In terms of when you're saying, is the team working together? Is this really for managers and to be better trained and better equipped to be able to spot these challenges? Yeah. Who would you say is accountable for it?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, it's for managers, but it's not only for managers. And I think this is really what I wanted to set out in the book is, there's absolutely tons of books out there for managers. There's tons of books out there for leaders. But, I wanted to write a book that was for every single person who's in any team, whether you're in your local committee, or whether you're in a charity, or whether you're on a board, or from the highest to the most junior member of a company. It's our responsibility as individuals to contribute and to call out better ways of working. And this book is intended to empower anyone, any team member, not just the team leader, to do that. That was the intention.
And could you describe what kind of culture the organization would need to have that, where it's not just the manager who's calling things out and driving change, but in essence, you're asking everyone to own the process and to also manage upwards, and if anything needs changing. So that feels like, I'm sure there are organizational cultures that don't necessarily support or encourage that kind of behavior. So what are the things you should be looking for to have in your organizational culture to drive that kind of behavior?
I think you're absolutely right. It does need to be a cultural permission, essentially. And so what I'd be looking for is that at every level in any company, you'd be simply giving people the permission to ask whether things can be improved. So whether that's, I keep being copied on a whole lot of irrelevant emails that waste my time, small thing, but that becomes quite big. Or why am I invited to constant meetings and I can never get any work done? Again, small things. To the big stuff, like, someone's really behaving badly, or there's a very toxic atmosphere in a particular team. and everything in between. It's about giving each individual the permission to ask that question, whether it's of each other, or whether it's of their manager, or whether it's of somebody in a more senior position, for example, in HR. So simply giving people that empowerment to say, it's up to each of us as individuals to think about how we can improve the way we work together.
And going back to something you previously mentioned, Pam, about performance, and that kind of points towards an idea of a shared understanding of our goal, right? Because good performance is essentially, is it in the right direction? You know, are we moving towards our the desired outcome? And I know you kind of talk about this in the book around setting those goals and the framework for setting those goals. So can you talk to me a bit more about how do you go about kind of effective goal setting, and then what follows afterwards? We have this goal. How do you communicate it, and how do you drive people towards achieving that outcome?
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, I think one of the things that perhaps we sometimes get wrong is we think that if we sit in the same room as each other, we're in a team. Or if we sit in the same department as each other, we're in a team. Or my least favorite one is, because we all attend the same meeting for 2 hours a week, we're in a team. Attending meetings or being in the same department is absolutely not being in a team. So, you know, if you're sitting in a group of people, great that you're sharing updates, super. But if somebody isn't, you know, attaching themselves to an action, if that group of people don't have a very specific goal that they're trying to achieve in a time period that they've agreed on, then they aren't a team. They're just a department or a meeting. So, you know, the first thing is, even if you are in a committee that is never going to end, or a board meeting, for example, that always needs to meet every month, you should still have specific goals with specific time periods attached to them, which you are serving. And, you know, definitely shouldn't be a whole lot of people who only meet and do nothing outside of that meeting. Which is interesting because, you know, in some of the teams that I've worked with, they are a group of people who simply come together to share updates. But in one of the clients that I work with, what they did as a result of this provocation was they said, well, we're spending 2 hours every Monday sharing updates with each other. Why don't we turn that on its head? And why don't we spend those 2 hours asking if anyone needs help? You know, so just changing the dynamic to, instead of information sharing, which frankly could have been an email, you know, to use the well-known meme, into something that actually results in, you know, a decision or an action or an idea, but with a time period. So coming back to goals, one of the most important tools in the book is about reframing your goal. And simply by looking at language together, the amount of times, Nelson, where people think they have agreed on the goal because they think they agree on the meaning of a word, but then they all think that that word means something completely different, is mind-boggling. So, you know, I think I've quoted a piece of research in the book that says that, you know, a majority of leaders and managers agree that digital transformation is super important for their company. In the same study, you know, very few people knew what digital transformation actually meant. Yeah. And so if you're all going, oh yeah, I'm on the digital transformation committee, but you all think it means something different. One person might think it means digital marketing, another person might think it's the intranet, another person might think it means emails. You know, you need to just start by going, what is it that we're actually trying to do, and trying to avoid those cliches. So that reframe your objective tool is all about taking what you are trying to do and reframing it so that you really understand the language that you share. And in doing that, you almost challenge each other to clarify what your goal is.
And what are your thoughts, Pam, on, I completely see that challenge, because when it is open to language like that, it's open to interpretation, right? And how you clarify it often. And I guess that's why so many successful companies have kind of adopted OKRs, right? Because the combination of a key result that has a metric that you can't really, it's clear as day, you can't really be confused around the metric that you're measuring and how that's going to contribute. Are there any other ways where you would suggest you get people on the same page and you're sure that people have understood it in the way that you expected them to have understood it?
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things about how we work together as humans in a collective is that it tends to be that we are quite polite to each other, especially at first when we don't know each other. And that's a good thing. I'm all for politeness. But some of the research has shown that, particularly in multicultural teams, politeness can get in the way of good decision making. And that's because we tend to want to agree with each other and not challenge each other too early because we don't want to cause offense. And so one of the things that is a really super important thing to do at the beginning of defining project goals or objectives is to almost enhance the challenge or the disagreement early. And I do mean this in a very positive and constructive way, but, if we were to disagree in future, what might it be about? Or where am I likely to go in opposition to you? And, in a friendly way, explore those options so that you're really trying to enhance the challenge, constructive challenge very early on. So there's all sorts of techniques like what's the worst that can happen, or where could this go if it goes wrong? But anything that you can help people to do much more early than, just sort of leaping on and getting on with the project, trying to define it. I don't know who the famous person was who said that if they wanted to chop down a tree in an hour, they would spend 50 minutes sharpening the axe.
Yeah, I think there's a few variations. I think even Einstein, I think about the
Einstein said everything.
Yeah.
It's that sort of really spending a little bit of time pushing and pulling each other's opinions, right. and then you can sort of move forward knowing what the challenges might be.
I just wanted to touch on your point around meetings. I mean, especially now where we're talking about an era of Zoom fatigue and people are, facing burnout from back-to-back meetings. And I find that kind of nods to a bigger topic, which is what we're seeing right now around, do we go to the office? Do we work from home? Is it hybrid? But really, I find the bigger question is not about where we're working, but it's how we're working. And a big part of that is synchronous and asynchronous. And it comes to the meeting point you mentioned around, am I in a meeting to hear these status updates, or could we have asynchronously shared that? So given you wrote this prior to the pandemic and all of this kind of remote work kicking off, what are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts on it now in terms of how prepared companies are for asynchronous work? And if they're not, what can they be doing to be more prepared for asynchronous work?
Look, I'm a massive fan of asynchronous work. Even before this, I have been, and I don't think companies are prepared enough. I think that they still believe that we need to be there for one person talking through 50 slides for 2 hours while everybody else pretends to listen, but they're actually on their email. I think that's just the absolute worst waste of energy, especially if you've got people joining from different time zones, some early in the morning, some late at night. To listen to something that could have been a podcast. Really, I do think that that's a massive challenge. And I think that probably more traditional companies are still struggling with that. Also, you mentioned a very important point, though, which is that the culture that we've developed over the last 15 months has been very intense, and it's been in response to a crisis. So we've all started to work even more ridiculously hard than we used to, and probably taking up the edges of what used to be our commute instead of taking that time back from ourselves. And so actually one of the most popular and most useful, I think, chapters in the book is chapter 3, which is all about taking back control of time. And essentially, it's about stopping your time from being taken up in bad meetings and being used on email, because a study showed that after all of your meetings and emails, the average knowledge worker has about 44% of their time left in the working week. So essentially, none of us start any work until like Wednesday afternoon, which is crazy.
Yeah.
We cannot allow that. And I think that's one of the most important resets and the most important habits that we need to overcome. Stop doing what has always been done just because that's the way it's always been done. There's a couple of companies who've done really good changes like that. So, for example, Vodafone made their meeting defaults into half an hour rather than 1 hour meetings. That saves in a massive amount of time. But the problem is that still might leave you with back-to-back 10 half an hour meetings. So what Channel 4 did was they banned people from putting back-to-back meetings. So they forced a 15-minute break between every meeting.
Right.
And then they also said on Fridays, no meetings. And so lots of companies are coming up with different things like that. I mean, I think those companies are amazing for doing that. I'm not always in favor of only company-wide policies, though, because I think you need to, as a team, discuss what are you trying to achieve, who's on our team and how do we best work together. So my team, for example, I've got 30 people. We work from all around the world. We always have worked remotely. So we've always worked asynchronously. One of the most simple things that we do, Nelson, I can tell you it saves us hours and hours every week, is we send voicemails, not emails.
Right.
So if you've got one email an update that you need to do, let's say you've just come from a client meeting and you need to update a whole lot of people, unless you need that email to be read, forever in the future, if it's only one update, just do a voicemail. It takes 5 minutes. You might sort of mess it up a little bit and not say the right thing first time, but don't worry. That's an update that goes out on WhatsApp to the group that needs to hear it, and it's done. Instead of me composing, which I would, an hour-long, beautifully written email that gets read once, or even not read at all, So just simple things like that. But that's about giving each other permission, because we've agreed that that's how we'll work together. And so it's not mandated. It's the reason why we do this is because we've agreed that I would rather hear a voicemail, while I don't know if I've got an urgent issue happening, I'd rather hear a voicemail while I'm cooking dinner rather than read a long email. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I love that. I love the whole kind of voicemail, voice note. Funny enough, the only person who sends me voice notes is my mum, and I send her one back. But she's the one who got me into it. And I was like, this is so good. It's asynchronous communication at its best. Come back to the kind of time management piece. I've found myself, once we realize actually a lot of people are putting in meetings, we're now doing internal meetings, external client meetings. As a manager, one of the things I found myself doing is having to work with people to audit their calendar, to help them almost audit their calendar and understand, is this meeting necessary or not? And it goes back to what you were kind of alluding to. The idea is you were used to that culture. And even with the minimum 30 minutes, it was a quick question which you felt like you couldn't communicate because you wasn't a strong written communicator, and therefore you needed to jump on a call, but the minimum window is 30 minutes, and therefore you're reluctant. And it comes down to this pain point that we've seen with a lot of clients that we work with, is the way we share knowledge. And you spoke about kind of bringing together collective intelligence. And what we found was companies who were used to kind of swiveling on their chair and tapping on someone's shoulder to get that answer to the question were no longer prepared when you couldn't do that. And instead, that kind of physical shoulder tapping turned into virtual shoulder tapping of constant Slack and Microsoft Teams messages. So how have you found the effective ways of bringing that collective intelligence and that kind of knowledge sharing between teams together, that could still work in a hybrid working environment?
Yeah, it's a really hard one, isn't it? I mean, I think it starts with creating rules of engagement. So, what we have lost in the very efficient virtual space is the chance to overhear each other. And especially for junior members or new people in the business, you lose that osmosis of what's happening, what's the culture, who's important, what do they say, how do they behave. And so, some of the things that we've been hearing people talking about and that we've been doing are just offering people buddies and shadowing opportunities, literally shadowing on virtual calls or just overhearing people. So as many chances as people can have, not to necessarily participate, but to overhear. But it does, the problem is it's not spontaneous, is it? So you're not having that water cooler chat or the walk to the train station or waiting outside the meeting room, and you need to create those things. You need to manufacture those things. So whether it's at the beginning of a meeting, making sure everybody gives you a little update on what's happening in their lives, or, quite a lot of our clients now are doing no agenda meetings. So, every Friday we'll meet for 2 hours and we'll just chat. You can be on the call, have your cameras on, have your lunch, chat about something. You don't even have to chat. You can just listen to other people chatting. Moments in the day where you are encouraging each other to have the informal knowledge sharing, because otherwise it does become very objectives-led and transactional. But then, your point about being invited to or doing meeting audits is a super important one, not just as an individual, because what we're helping teams to do now, and you have to do it as a team because you need to sort of support each other in it. But what we're helping people to do now is sort of have a little bit of a are you valuing my time template or question. So, yes, Nelson, I'd love to have a meeting with you. What's it about? oh, can we just talk about in the meeting? What, if you could tell me what it's about in advance, then great. And then it could be, Nelson, you wanted to tell me about 3 options that we have for, I don't know, our next learning journey. And so I could say, well, do you want to send those in advance? And then the meeting will be about how we decide together. Anything that sort of asks people to value your time, because I think what has happened in the past is people have been turning up to use the meeting to talk through their own thoughts, but they're asking you for your time, but they haven't valued your time enough because they haven't prepared their own thoughts. And I do mean this all very respectfully. People aren't doing this on purpose. People are themselves very busy. But if you say respectfully to them, I'm struggling with my time, would it be possible for you to send through those options in advance, and then we could spend 15 minutes discussing them? That would be awesome. And, that hopefully allows people to then value your time next time that they ask for it.
Out of the kind of the tools you talk about in the book, Pam, what has there been any surprising feedback, kind of tools that you've seen people use in interesting ways, or they've built on your ideas in a way that you hadn't previously imagined? Could you talk about maybe some of the tools and interesting ways you've seen them applied?
Yeah, I mean, on an overall level, I have to say, Nelson, I've been quite surprised at some of the most simplest tools being the most effective, or at least people being the most surprised by them. Honestly, I suppose because I think about these things all the time and I've seen them working in different ways, some of the simplest things. So even if it's just one tool, it can really transform how people work together, or how people talk together, and how they achieve their projects. So, an example one is on the time one, where in this audit of how people were spending their time, somebody, and it wasn't my suggestion, it was theirs, they said, well, why don't we look at the whole year and what we're spending, our whole team of 30 people, what are we spending our time on? And what they worked out was that through the year, there were 4 different reporting moments. And in that reporting moment, the whole team was out for a week, essentially preparing the report. Right. So what they did was, with the supportive leaders, was they decided to make that into 3 times a year, not 4. So for the whole team of 30 people, they've saved an entire week of work, and that was fundamental to me. And another different team did the same. They sort of decided to do zero-based budgeting, but for their time. So they said, let's scrap everything. Let's scrap all of the repeating meetings across every single team, and then start from scratch. What are we going to put in? How often are we going to put it in? For how long? Whether it will be face-to-face or not. Just that kind of basics, which I hadn't really thought of.
No, I love that, because I can imagine so many companies who, once they switched to remote, would have just kept the same meeting cadence that they had when they were in the office, right? And you don't review it because that's the way it's always been. And I think that idea of starting from scratch and forcing every action to be deliberate and intentional. Yeah, I love that. I can see, because they're actually questioning, why do we need this meeting in the first place? Which they probably never did. And they probably never did for the God knows how many years prior to that.
Totally. And I'm so annoyed that I didn't come up with a zero-based time budgeting tool.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. What do you think, coming back to kind of leaders and what the leaders of an organization and managers could be doing? We mentioned everyone needs to own this, but to kind of create the fertile soil for the seeds to be planted, what can leaders be doing to supercharge their teams?
Well, again, one of the things that I saw when I was researching the book and I was interviewing lots of different people was there were absolutely tons of articles written for leaders about how to be leaders. But there were no articles at all about how to manage your leaders, so how to manage up.
Yeah.
And so actually, I'm going to turn your question on its head, if you don't mind, because actually, I think that's part of it. And I've been in lots of teams as well where, we might slightly moan about whether our leader understands our team or not, or, they don't necessarily give us the support we want, or maybe they change their mind too much. But there's this sort of sense which really came from 2 centuries ago where, the bosses are the ones in control and we're the ones who do what they say, which is absolutely no longer the case, right? It's not, life's too complicated. So treating the leaders sort of like parents who we have to wait for is a time that's over. And so one of the most important things that teams should do, and leaders, is manage their leaders, manage their stakeholders, really consciously take that on as their responsibility. It's our responsibility to keep the leaders, updated, to keep them involved in this. And obviously, leaders, if they're really good leaders, want that. They want to be asked in when they've got support to give. They want to be challenged. They want to be brought into projects. So I think it's a bit of a two-way street there.
Yeah, I love that, Pam, because we talk about this a lot with L&D teams that we work with, because essentially in many companies, L&D is almost a struggle to get a seat at the table and trying to convince the business around the value they can bring to drive performance and results. And I think often it's that case of how do you manage up, how do you convince the leaders of the value this is going to bring? So I love that. Before we go on to the quick fire round, Pam, I want to touch on your first book, the workshop book. And this is, an area that is completely been disrupted overnight. All of the in-person physical workshops where people are doing were completely out of the picture. The default knee-jerk reaction was people basically took what they were doing in the classroom, they jumped on Zoom, and they did the same thing. So I can see the face you're pulling. So talk to me. What should people be doing?
Yes. So, one of our big clients had taken their 5-day, 8 hours a day online face-to-face program and put it online. I was just like, oh, why? I don't understand. No, don't do that. So we do lots of, our main bread and butter is running workshops, always has been. And we had been doing quite a few online workshops before COVID anyway. And of course, then and we'd been talking about how effective they were. Then our clients sort of needed to take notice. And certainly we didn't know everything. And certainly we've learned a lot in the last year as well, Nelson. But it's absolutely the case now that from our perspective and from our clients' perspective, and I'm talking some of the big companies in the world, everyone is saying online workshops are better than in-person workshops. Now, it doesn't mean taking your 8-hour workshop and putting it in an 8-hour Zoom. That's awful. However, what we have started to do is make, let's say it's an 8-hour in-person workshop. That used to be, in my world, in London with a whole lot of senior extroverts who were very confident and who'd arrive at 7 a.m. and leave at 7 p.m. And, they spend the whole day, being very, very energetic with each other. And that obviously excludes lots of different people for many reasons. It excludes people who can't travel to London because, hardly anyone can. It's so expensive. It excludes people who have family situations where they can't be there at those early or late hours. It excludes introverts. And obviously lots of different other people who are excluded for all sorts of reasons. So the online journeys that we're now running, we've found that they've just been so much better at being more accessible and inclusive. So we've got a higher representation of many more global team members, not just internally in big corporations, but externally, because those incredible brains that you would never be able to fly in from somewhere else are able to participate right there with you. So you've got the diversity of thinking, but also you've got neurodiversity as well. And our team have just now gone on a massive neurodiversity training because we've found it's so valuable for neurodiverse ways of thinking. Because I'm used to working with extroverts, but now we put everything on an online whiteboard, a mural.
Yeah.
That means that, instead of the 8 hours in one block with everyone being very confident and speaking their mind, you've got those moments, but you've got them in 2-hour blocks. Then those people who are in the background listening and thinking can reflect. They can add to the online whiteboard, while they're thinking about it. Everyone, including the extroverts, who, by the way, also need to reflect sometimes, have thought about things overnight. You might have even spoken to other stakeholders or your bosses or somebody different. Then you come back refreshed. It keeps the energy up. So there's all sorts of reasons why we believe online is even better than in person, which is not to say in person won't come back. I think where we're going to go now is that in person is really about building trust in relationships. So, whilst we're looking at hybrid working, I think we're also going to look at hybrid workshops. So I've just come off a call with a client where we're going to do in different markets in-person mini meetings, right, and then all come back together into one screen for the face-to-face in person, but online. so that you can mix that journey up, so that at the beginning of a project, you are creating trust, getting to know each other. Someone said to me the other day, they've had new people joining their team and no one knows how tall each other are. So they all took pictures in door frames to see how tall you are. And then we can work online. But the problem is you do need to keep it very equal, because the access and the equality of that access is really important. So, if you are looking to speak to older people or people from different kinds of backgrounds, I do lots of public sector work here in Portsmouth, and there are just obviously people who are not comfortable or wanting to come online. So you've got to be super careful that you're still not excluding people.
And do you find the same process of what we were talking about before around the asynchronous, synchronous, and almost making a intentional decision around how much of what we were doing in the office do we replicate now that we're working remote? And I found, talking to a lot of people in the early days of the lockdown, once the workshops went on to Zoom, like you said, they were replicating exactly what they were doing in their 5-day, 8-hour sessions. But then there was almost this process of trying to figure out what really still needs to be synchronous. And that stuff can go into a Zoom session. But even that, then the challenge that I was hearing a lot around is, how do you keep people engaged? So tell us, Pam, how do you keep people engaged when you're running a workshop online?
Okay. Well, yeah, it's hard, isn't it? So, one of the things that we've suffered is people had terrible habits before of being in online meetings, didn't they? So, I think online meetings, this sort of dinosaur history of that was that funny phone in the middle of the boardroom. Yeah. Everyone else was around, and there was some person spluttering from a different city, sometimes being remembered and sometimes just being left in the room while we went for coffee, And I think we've sort of slightly taken some of those behaviors now. And the other, so what we've done is, some very simple things to keep people engaged. And the first one has, and I think everyone sort of realized this, is just having cameras on, being present and actually being there. What we do as facilitators, which I'm sure you do too, as trainers and as L&D experts, is just keep the energy so that people are, you can tell when someone's nodding and smiling versus reading their emails. But we also have some, you have to be quite respectful, because the reason why people are doing their emails is they're under a lot of pressure. They're sometimes in fearful positions in their jobs. So, it's not about being strict, but it's about explaining. So what we tend to do is send a 30-second video in advance of a session and say, I'm Pam, I'm going to be facilitating, cameras will be on, and towards the end of the video, I've got this kind of ball in the background there, which I bring out and I say, I'll be hiding this ball in the back of shot. So when you come online, first person to see the ball gets an Amazon voucher. And then, so of course, you're setting up a little bit of this is different. Then you can send a picture, closer to the time, you can send a picture of just the ball to everyone and go, if you don't know why you're getting this picture of the ball, you've not watched the welcome video yet. And everyone's like, what's that? So they go in and watch it.
Yeah.
And of course, the advantage of getting people to look for the ball is that everyone who would have normally been late arrives early. Do you see what I mean? So
yeah,
just a little bit about entertaining and keeping people in a nice way on their toes, not trying to catch them out, but trying to make them want to be there. And we use lots of games and immersion experiences. Like, if possible, logistically, we'll send people a pack that they have to open in at the same time as everybody else, or order them lunch, or just little things that make people entertained. But I think that the energy comes from speaking to each other. So as soon as you've got someone doing 50 slides, send that in advance, and make the live time should be about small breakout rooms, everybody doing something, coming back and presenting, and that's where your energy comes from.
Over to the quickfire round now, Pam. Are you ready? I'm going to throw some questions at you, and a relatively quick answer would do. Let's start off with the best advice you've ever been given.
No is a full sentence.
Oh, okay. I like it. What tips would you give people who want to create content that's easy to digest and use?
People don't read anything anymore. So do it as a picture or do it as a film. But if you're expecting people to read anything, they won't.
Okay. What do you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your career?
Oh, I wish that I'd been told that I could speak up if someone was behaving badly. I think that probably maybe wasn't more possible, wasn't as possible back then, but it is now.
If you could recommend a book that's not either one of your books, but another book that you think would be great for anyone working in a team, what would you recommend?
This one actually just been released. It's called The Hidden Edge by Jodie Rogers. I know her. And it's all about mental fitness. So how you can help yourself to be more resilient and more healthy to enjoy your work more.
Well, I like it. I'm going to add that to my list. This is a bit of a selfish one for me, Pam. I'm in the process of writing my first book. What tip would you give to a first-time author?
Oh, nice, Nelson. Lots of tips. What I learned from writing my book was be as simple as possible in every sentence, because I was trying to be really clever with lots of academic language, and that was the wrong way to go. But also tell lots of stories. I think that was the thing that I learned most about the recent book. I had tons of research. I had lots of interviews. Again, trying to be too clever. And actually, it was the stories that were most enjoyable for me to write, and also most enjoyable, I hope, for people to read.
Thanks for that one, Pam. What's one thing you've changed your mind about lately?
I'm worried about the difference between home and office working. I think that I thought it would be clear cut. I thought that everybody would love to come back into the office, and I think it's not going to be a one size fits all. I don't think it's going to be this team does 40%, this team does 60%. I think it's going to change every week. It's going to change every month and per team. So I think probably the days of a habitual pattern are maybe over, and that's challenging because people are going to have to reevaluate on a regular basis.
What's your number one productivity hack?
Eat the frog early, or whatever that thing is. Do the hard task.
I heard that one. What is that one?
Do the hard task at the beginning of the day. Get it over with.
My last one for you, Pat, is what's the one skill you would like to develop and why?
I'd really like to learn how to write creatively for fiction now, because in that process of learning how to write stories, it made me think actually there are lots of really interesting stories and people that I've learned. So I'm going to try and learn to do some creative writing. I'm taking a course.
Pam, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Nelson. I've enjoyed it.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Hopefully you're ready to start supercharging your team with some of those great tips. If you want to connect with Pam or find out more information about the Supercharged Teams book, all the links you need can be found in the description. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please do think about subscribing, sharing, leaving us a review, or telling a friend. It goes a long way in helping the show grow. Thanks, and see you next time.